But firstly, huge thanks for the invitation to come back. The presentation that I gave at the ADR conference was a kind of big overview piece, talking about systems, data linkage, and how we've kind of used that or are trying to use some of these systems to achieve our goals of trying to prevent and end homelessness. Today's talk is really specific, so we're going down to a very particular lens, and that's looking at school settings and school administrative data and the potential of linked school and homelessness data to help drive policy and practice change. And it's not all a story of, as these things ever are, it's not all a story of success. Actually, this first half, there's some really interesting research, but some kind of caveats and warnings about really some of the dangers of finding interesting stuff out and how that might get used and the agendas that it might support. And then the second part moves on to say, well, so what do we do about that? So that's today's talk. It's about schools, it's about homelessness prevention, and taking on a journey through a number of studies that we've conducted. And those who are familiar with any work that I do in this space know that I'll always start with acknowledging Ian Thomas's role in this. He is the brains behind any data linkage work we do. I'm very much oriented towards the policy and practice side and social policy. And Ian is the lead statistician on our housing and homelessness themed work that we do within ADR Wales. So I'm very much presenting to a lot of Ian's hard work. Right, moving on. Let's see the next slide. So the context of the study is this. Some of you may have no working knowledge around homelessness. Some of you may be online from homelessness organisations or experts in this field. So apologies if it's either too basic or too advanced, whatever. But here's the context. Firstly, is that most of the homelessness policy and research that exists in the global north is primarily focused on experiences and responses to people who find themselves, particularly adults, who are sleeping rough on the streets. And I imagine for many who signed up to today's event, when you saw the term homelessness, if you sat down and thought, who was I picturing? What experiences were you picturing? You were probably picturing a single adult, probably a man with multiple support needs, sleeping on the street. And that drives a lot of policy, a lot of research, that particular subgroup of people experiencing homelessness. And rightfully so, there's a lot of attention there because there are huge vulnerabilities and huge harms experienced by those people. But actually, when we talk about homelessness, we're talking about a much broader group of people experiencing real housing insecurity. And that includes, for instance, people who are what we would call sofa surfing, moving between accommodations, sleeping on people's sofas or equivalent. But it's also people who are over-occupying accommodation, people who are being evicted from accommodation. It's a much broader definition than we perhaps imagine. That's important. Also, in the focus, we've generally focused on that point of crisis, on managing homelessness. So dealing with the fact that people are already homeless rather than looking at what we could have done before and earlier. Now, I say recently, within the last decade, 2 decades, we've seen a real shift towards prevention and efforts to act far earlier to stop people becoming homeless in the first place. And in that shift, I mean, still the majority of spending, of activity is at crisis point. But in this shift in thinking and in legislation, policy practice, it's raised new questions about who can we work with? How can we identify those people who are at greatest risk and support them best? What does early intervention look like? So a whole space in which academics, policymakers, practitioners, people with lived experience are trying to work to identify new solutions and effective solutions. And what I argue, and what many of us argue, is that in this space of early intervention, we need a much greater focus on childhood and young people's experiences. And that's for a number of reasons. But to give you one example, even if you were taking an approach that said, look, we have to focus on those who are in most acute need, they are the predominantly single men on streets, then previous research that we've done with that population has told us that about half of those single adults first became homeless as young people under the age of 21. And so even if your focus of work is on that particular subpopulation, you should have an interest in early childhood and interventions with young people, because that will have a demonstrable impact on single homeless experiences. So a definite need for new innovation, new activity in the childhood space. And of course, in that context, if we're going to talk about young people and children and families, then that leads us to the kind of the nexus between education, schools, and homelessness as a key focus. Other groups who are particularly vulnerable to homelessness, for instance, are people making risky transitions, or transitions that are made risky. So transitions from care, transitions from prison. They are in settings where you can easily identify people. Education is the key setting where we know we can identify and act with children and young people. So that's the context for the research. It's what's led us there. So let's talk about a couple of studies. So the first study is a piece done through ADR that looked at the relationship between homelessness and school attendance. It was one of our earlier pieces of work for the ADR. For those, apologies definitely here, because I know a lot of you will be more expert on ADR than I am. But ADR Wales, just for those who are perhaps calling in and aren't familiar, is a partnership between Swansea and Cardiff universities and Welsh Government, and is all about producing policy relevant research using de-identified administrative data, frequently linked data, and in the Welsh context, we've tended to use SAIL, the SAIL data bank. And I always thank Ian in my talks, but I also have to thank the team in SAIL, because yeah, I am in a position where I access the data, I receive the data, I receive analysis from Ian, but we are building on the groundwork that's been laid, the foundations and huge amount of work of the team at SAIL that enable all of this to be done. So a huge thanks to them. So we work through the SAIL data bank, and that SAIL data bank allows us to look at case level linked data, and there's a little bit there about the alpha fields that we use. But again, for those that aren't familiar, it means that data can go into SAIL from, for instance, education data, health data, or homelessness data, and we're able to link that data and follow people's experiences through these different systems over time. So really powerful resource. And for this particular study, the data sets that we've been able to use and to link are a small homelessness data set. I say small because it's limited to one local authority's data. It relates to statutory homelessness data, which I'll come on to elaborate on in a second, for around a 5-year period. And there were nearly 17,000 homelessness incidents in that data set. We also have the Welsh Demographic Service dataset and education data through the pupil level annual school census that gives us attendance data. So to just pause a little bit and talk about the homelessness data that we're using, it's one local authority's homelessness data. And the way in which legislation works or homelessness services work in the Welsh context, also in England and Scotland, is if somebody is at risk of homelessness or they are homeless, they would present at the local authority for help. for assistance, and the local authority is under a legal duty to provide assistance to anybody that makes an application for assistance. On the point of making that application, somebody would enter into this data set, and then a whole load of decisions are made and supports provided, and that's also recorded. For the purposes of this study, we're literally using somebody's application as an indicator of housing need and homelessness. So they're making this statutory homelessness application. Now, as with all wonderful administrative data sets, it wasn't intended for me to use, and it wasn't intended for other researchers to use. That was administrative data, and we're using the exhaust of that data set. So they had no intent that it could be linked. So they didn't worry quite so much about the completeness of certain fields. And so when we've sought to match this data, we had a 75% match rate, which isn't bad. I think a lot of people would have hypothesized that the nature of the population that we're working with, the match rate may have been lower. And our match rate was in line with another piece of work that's been done on a different data set in Wales, but far below the match rate experienced in the Scottish context of some really good work done there, where health and homelessness was explored by a good colleague up in the Scottish government team, where they achieved a 94% match rate. They had different fields on which they could match. But here's the tricky bit. And again, it's the nature of messy administrative data that we're all dealing with, is when you make a homelessness application, the nature of law means that you assist the household, and local authorities in Wales were only recording the head of household. So the head of household details were recorded. That's an adult. So the adult has made the application. There will be children in the family. That's really problematic in a study that wants to look at the children's experiences in those households, which was what we wanted to do. So we had to, and I say we in the royal way, I mean Ian Thomas, had to find a method through which we could find other people living within that household, i.e. the children. So that takes us on to our next stage, our next slide, which is about how we created, and Ian created, this pupil level linked data set. And so working on the left-hand side of this slide, we've got the housing team data, the homelessness data, where we've got adult applicants. We then locate those adults in the Welsh Demographic Service data, and then we can identify in those residences, in those households, children that are also there. So we've got an ability to find children living in those adult households. At each of these stages, we are getting less and less precise with our data set, and we recognise that as a major limitation. But we have then a cohort of young people in households experiencing housing issues for the first time in Wales. Then we're able to find those pupils within the annual pupil level census, so we can determine their attendance at schools and draw some comparisons. So that was the pupil level data set. That was a big task and a big challenge, and is the sort of messy solution that we have to come up with when we're using this type of administrative data. It's not ideal, it's pragmatic, and there is a lot of work going on to address that data set, certainly the homelessness data set. So there's been a long-standing effort to create a case level data set that would have records of all members of the household and be designed for linkage, so we make sure the fields are more complete. Okay, so that's the process, the method, and the context. So what did we find? The two or three key findings. One are actually we've got a prevalence rate of about 1 to 2% of pupils experiencing homelessness or making a homeless application, and then absenteeism. Broadly speaking, what we find is for children in households who've made a homelessness application, you're likely to have greater levels of absenteeism. So you're missing 5 days more of school a year, and on the measure of persistent absenteeism in each year of the data, we could see higher rates of persistent absenteeism amongst the pupils who are in homeless households. So we're talking, a difference between 7 and 12, 5 and 13, 3 and 15, 3 and 10% in any given year. And of course, there's plenty of literature and wider research that talks about the implications of absenteeism on later outcomes, etc. And really, these are potentially compounding disadvantages. So experiencing homelessness is known to have implications in the future outcomes of children, as well as then absenteeism. So some really interesting findings. A lot of work went to produce this, the findings that are encapsulated in this one slide, and I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation where you can go and see the details of the analysis that led to this, and you can find out more, particularly about the limitations, but really interesting findings telling us about this association between homelessness and absenteeism. So what does all this mean? Let's not just stop there and be traditional academics and leave that off in the ether. What does it mean for policy and practice? Now, you can imagine our goal, as I said at the start, is to move upstream to try and identify people who are at risk, act and prevent later harms. And if what we've shown is that there's this association between absence from school and homelessness, it leads us to these assumptions that says if we're looking in a classroom, then it's a possibility or it's a likelihood that people who are not attending, people whose attendance is lower, might well be at risk of or potentially already experiencing homelessness. So that's the group of young people, the group of children that we want to work with to try and prevent further harms, prevent homelessness or prevent further harms. That would be a logical conclusion. And in fact, that is the situation we're in. And so the Welsh Government has put some considerable resources into trying to prevent youth homelessness. And as part of that, a key element of it is the youth engagement and progression framework that's been updated and outlines a process of organizations working together to try and identify young people who need, and that could be around educational disengagement, but also specifically it's about identifying young people who are at risk of homelessness and then offering supports to improve their outcomes. And in the current guidance, what they say is that early identification systems in this progression framework have focused on attendance, but also behaviour and attainment indicators, all tied to education. And our research very much, this early research very much backs that up. It says that there's an association. So yeah, let's use attendance as a flag alongside behaviour and attainment. Great. Okay. So it feels like our research is playing into the agenda. We can take no credit of around that progression framework, but it seems to tie in. We could stop there. But actually, in parallel to this work, we've been doing some other work inspired by our wonderful Australian colleagues that begins to problematize some of our assumptions around who's at risk. And this work is all based around an intervention called Upstream. And the Welsh version, Upstream Cymru, we're going to just kind of drill into, understand its origins and look at some of the administrative data that we've been able to access from the intervention. And as I say, begin to challenge some of our assumptions around who's at risk and who we might therefore intervene with. So as I say, the Upstream project or intervention has its origins in the Geelong project in Australia, and has been replicated in Canada, the US, in Wales, and now in Belgium, England, and Scotland. And we were right at the forefront in Wales of developing this alongside learning from the Australians and doing it alongside the Canadians and the Americans. And what it is a coming together, very much a collaboration of schools and services, much like the Youth Engagement Progression Framework asked for, a collaboration of services. But crucially, the keystone of the intervention is this universal population screening tool, an opportunity for young people through the survey, the screening tool, to tell us something about what's going on at home. And I'll come on and describe it in a bit more in a second. And then a process of collaborative decision making with young people, their families, about what supports might be needed in order to prevent further harm and prevent homelessness. So the screening tool is self-completion. It's conducted in secondary schools and with guidance and support from the upstream intervention team. It's got a whole load of modules around well-being, resilience, but also crucially educational engagement and around homelessness. That data, it's because it's online, is available immediately to schools to intervene with. But we're also then able to access the data set that's produced. Useful to know, though not crucial to this presentation, is that after the screening tool, there's an intervention. So the intervention is typically the family mediation or wider youth engagement work. So you're identifying young people who are disengaging from family life, often through conflict at home, or they're disengaging from school, etc. So the interventions focus on those two things. So that's upstream as a package, as an intervention, and a wee bit about the survey. But to give you a little bit more, we're able to access the data set that the intervention produces, and we've had access to 4,300 unique pupil responses from September 2020 to December 23. And that data is collected across 12 schools in South Wales and the Valleys. There are a load of questions in the tool, but the measures we're particularly interested in for this presentation are two. So we've got a homelessness measure. There are lots of questions there because they're trying to identify early risk of homelessness. But the one that we're centering in on for this analysis is a question that tells you that somebody has had to stay away from home for at least one night because they couldn't stay in the home environment. Now, this is well before a homelessness application would have been made, so it's much earlier than the first data set that we talked around, the statutory homeless data. This is about early intervention. It's an early sign that somebody is homeless, far earlier than making a homeless application. So we've got that question, and then we've got some data on self-reported educational engagement, of which we've produced these 3 binary indicators relating to behavioral disengagement. So those are exclusions or suspension, skipping school, and getting into trouble. So far more aligned with the kind of the 3 characteristics that the progression framework talked of as important. And then we produced a measure of intensity of a disengagement, basically from 0 to 3 areas. What did we find when we analysed this data? So firstly, in terms of prevalence of youth homelessness, those that were forced to sleep away from home, we're talking about 6% of the young people. That's a first. We didn't know this before that survey had been conducted in schools. And has been pretty stable when the survey's been conducted over time, so around 6%. And then on school disengagement, you can see the data there, but really interesting that around 78-80% of 4 and 5 pupils, there's no real sign of disengagement. So nearly 80% of young people. And then when we look to cross-tabulate, to look at the relationship again between educational engagement and homelessness, we find some really interesting data. So of the pupils experiencing homelessness, using our measure or the measure in that data set, around 54% showed some form of disengagement from school. So just over half, some form of disengagement from school. And that was much higher than the 20%, the 1 in 5 of pupils who weren't at risk of homelessness or weren't homeless, who also showed some form of disengagement. So supporting that narrative that if you are homeless, you are more likely to be disengaging from school. It's supporting it. Okay, so we're reinforcing that message. But here's the crucial thing. Our goal is to identify who we might want to support, who's at risk, so that we can prevent further harm and a later presentation at homeless services. So if we flip this, that the opposite side of this, the message is that a really large proportion of pupils who'd experienced youth homelessness or really early signs of homelessness had no direct indicators of school disengagement, none. Self-report, admittedly, and all the caveats around that, but around 46%, just under half, had no signs of school disengagement. So the assumption that we would know who they are, we're beginning to question simply by their school disengagement. So coming back to our image of being in the classroom, trying to identify who we want to work with, who we need to support. If we continue to follow the assumptions as we have at the moment in the youth engagement progression framework, and I know there's work being done, if we assume that we can use educational disengagement as our indicator, we're going to miss about half of those young people. So the tool that Upstream is using, where there are more explicit questions and opportunities for young people to actually express what's happening at home in their home life, it shows the value of that tool in addition to any existing data that we might have on educational disengagement. So really challenging our assumptions and challenging the sorts of implications that were coming out of our earlier work. So moving forward, so I'm nearly there and ready to go into discussion, is there's some really interesting work now happening in this space. So Welsh Government is currently, the consultation is closed on a white paper that looks towards ending homelessness in Wales. And in there, kind of, I think it's fair to say the kind of the pivotal change in there, beyond a couple of issues around abolishing priority need, but the pivotal change is a duty on other public services to identify and act to prevent homelessness. So on health settings, on social services. And the working group that recommended this act included education there. The white paper is a little bit more vague on the inclusion of education. But this process and of identifying risk and everything that we've learned from this data set could become a duty. And our hope is that these lessons that we've learned that say move beyond educational disengagement as your proxy for risk is really important if you're going to expect public services and education to do this identification task as a legal requirement. So really interesting stuff and huge potential for change. And finally, if you're interested to know more, you can find out about the kind of the package of work we're doing around housing and homelessness on the ADR Wales website. There's a link there. And then two very similar publications on the first piece of work that I've presented on around families and school attendance, family homelessness and school attendance. You can see the links there. If I was going to one of them, I'd go to Ian's article because we've kind of updated, or he's updated the analysis in that article. We're yet to publish on the Upstream data. You got first sight of those statistics today. So I hope that's been helpful and looking forward to some discussion around it. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.